get into our lesson. I brought all three with me just to make sure there were no questions. And what I mean by that is I'm going back to let me see. I want to make sure everybody's on the same page. I went all the way back to chapter 10, session 16. So let's just take a gander at that before we get into today's lesson. This is the one with the angel in the little book. This one right here. I want to make sure you had no questions on that before we get out of it. We did a lesson on this in chapter 10. I had lecture notes. Basically, wanted to. Are we recording now, Gene? I want to welcome you guys on the internet. I'm sorry about last week. Gene brought everything over to record the lesson, and I forgot to put this microphone on. So you got a lot of visual and no audio. So that was my fault, but we will make up for that at some point. So lesson 10, basically dealing with another angel. And we said we're pretty sure that's the Archangel Michael. And we really dwelt a long time on the fact that this angel was one of another kind, not Jesus Christ. We talked about the little book being the scroll. And at the end of verse 10, we talked about it being sweet and bitter, and how God's word many times to us is sweet as we read it, but becomes bitter when we have to go through the manifestation of his word at times. Are there any questions on chapter 10 or session 16? Okay, I'm going to let that one go. We did have 3 questions come in by email this week. They were from the evening class. They had to do with the multitude that would be in heaven under the altar. Had to do with if we are aware of what's going on earth. If we're not going to be aware of what's going on earth, how come that's in chapter 5 and chapter 9? That the multitude would be asking when God would punish those that are still on earth. We will be aware of what's going on only through the eyes of heaven. Okay, we talked about it a little bit this morning. I don't like to get into those lessons because that's not my lesson. Somebody else is teaching it. But we tend to put God in a box or heaven in a box and say, this is how things are going to be in heaven, Pam. But we really don't know. We have a very small box of understanding. Our job here at New Hope is to help you to stretch that box as much as we can. But to be honest with you, as long as you are in the flesh, you're going to be in the box of sin seed, of a fleshly body. It is what it is. Heaven is a very compelling, intriguing, beautiful, amazing community that we will be in. We will know each other. We'll understand everything. There will be no questions. At times, it appears to me that through the eyes of heaven, we'll be aware of something going on down here. In other words, when there's an outburst of worship, or there's the pause before the war that's going to happen. I want you to understand, you'll be in heaven from that perspective. You won't be worried about what's going on here. Does that make sense? You'll know something's going on there. Because you're in heaven, you'll know that, but it won't be like you're following people around worrying about it. That's not what happens to us in heaven, okay? So that was the question that came in on the email. Then we got to session 17, which is chapter 11, and this dealt with the 2 witnesses. And we said, we taught through biblical script, prophetic weight, that this was Moses and Elijah, okay? And we talked about why. This was a long lesson. I gave you a plethora of scriptural foundation for this lesson, and the fact that they were assassinated, they were left in the street for 3 days, and then supernaturally brought back to life, 3.5 days, I'm sorry. And we talked heavily in this lesson about how the 7th one of each judgment, the next 7 are wrapped up in that. In other words, the 7th seal gives us the 7 trumpets, and the 7th trumpet gives us the 7 bowls. We talked about that a lot in session 17. I have a lot of lecture notes I gave you here, but most of that was for the two witnesses. And remember, their two objectives, if you don't have this, was to preach the gospel and proclaim God's judgment. That's what the two witnesses will be doing. We talked about the temple and the makeup of the temple, about how only the priest could go into the Holy of Holies. And of course, that was the chapter that we talked about measuring that and not measuring the outer courts. Remember there in session 17, we made several remarks about 42 months and 3.5 years, or 1,260 days. Each one of those referred to one half or the other of the tribulation. I gave you 4 reasons why we thought they were Moses and Elijah, because of the miracles that they'd already done in 2 Kings. Bless you. The Jewish tradition expects Moses and Elijah to come back. Both of them represent the law, and both left the earth in an unusual way. All right. Hi, Don. Let's get into chapter 12 if you have your book or your device with you. I want to get into chapter 12. You say we didn't do the end of chapter 11. The end of chapter 11 is pretty much a worship time, and it's not really imperative that we get into those last few verses. If you have questions about it, I can certainly answer those. But the end of chapter 11 pretty much deals with the seventh trumpet and the worship being God being glorified and worshiped in heaven. So I thought it would be better to go ahead and let's keep our momentum going, and let's get into chapter 12, because this one is very interesting and it keeps the ball rolling. So let's get there and let's read a few verses together. We're only going to go through verse 6 today in this lesson. This chapter will be divided into 3 sessions. And I'll give those to you in just a minute, but we're going to take our time because this is important. This 12 and 13 identifies 7 symbolic persons that really changed the tone of Revelation. And I want to take our time and go through that. My big stand is still over in the sanctuary, Mike. I just realized we forgot to bring it all back over here. If you were here, my big white one, if you were here Sunday morning for the baptism, we thought we had everything together. The place was packed. There were people everywhere. And then Brother Mike, our lead deacon, said, we don't have the steps to get into baptism. So I said, okay, then I can't get up there if we don't have the steps. So someone said, let me get Jacob to go get them. Well, you have to really, Jacob's my son, you have to really give him detailed instructions. So we shut the door, and me and Mike were standing there with all the people, in our baptism clothes, and it was a good while. And Mike said, what in the world is he doing? Because we figured he'd come around the back door. No, Jacob comes in the front door, right down through everybody with the steps, and he's on one side of the door, and we're on the other. Both of us are waiting for each other. It was hilarious, but we did get the steps in and got baptized. And my white stand is still over there, and I missed that thing. So let's read the first 6 verses of chapter 12. This is an extremely important chapter, and I see Michelle's not here. We want to make sure we get her a lesson, because now we're going to start to identify the characters, if you will, that are going to be in the great war in heaven. All right, or the great war that has been existed since beginning of time. Chapter 12, verse 1. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain, to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. And his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to earth. This is the famous verse that everybody refers to as to where the demons came from, okay? And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. Now, I want to draw your attention to verse 14 in regard to the woman fleeing to the wilderness. Verse 14, but the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time and times half a time from the presence of the serpent. Back over to verse 6, for 1,260 days, indicating the second half of the tribulation, or the great tribulation. Father God, thank you for the reading of your word. I pray that you'd help us now as we endeavor to study your word, that you would bless our obedience and open our eyes and hearts to your word, your way, and your will. For it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, let's do some lecture notes to get us into this. This is really extremely interesting. First of all, you'll see in verse 1, and let's reiterate, our lecture notes are just a very generic, general overview of what we're going to study today for you to write notes to however you want. If you do shorthand, or if you write notes out, very thoroughly, whatever you want to do, or you don't even have to write the notes for this. It's up to you, but it will help you to understand the lesson once we get into it. Here in verse 1, John makes a point of writing a great sign. And so, once again, I want to remind you, there are no wasted words in God's word. So what does he mean? When we break that down into the context that was written in the Greek, a great sign, it's the first of 7 signs in the last half of Revelation. So now we're going to enter a symbolic portion of Revelation now, okay? And if you remember way back when I gave you that pendulum thing from heaven to earth, now we're looking into heaven now, and this is purely symbolic, or you could say allegorical. He's symbolizing things. So the great sign is the first of 7 signs that are going to appear now in the last half of Revelation, which is where we are. We're in chapter 12. We're just a little bit past halfway, okay? Point number 2, John's going to mention a woman here as we get out into verse 1 and a little bit of verse 2. A great sign appeared in heaven, and a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. That woman is the symbolic representation of Israel. So every time you see woman now in Revelation, that's going to be to represent Israel. Let me fix this real quick. So the woman represents Israel, or God's chosen people. Okay? You'll see that at some times. Now I want to give you this while we're here on the subject of women in Revelation. There are 3 symbolic women that are going to appear in Revelation. I want to give you these so you know. 3 symbolic women. First of all was Jezebel. We saw her in chapter 2, verse 20. Jezebel, so I would write number 1, Jezebel. She represents, in parentheses, she represents paganism. Jezebel represents paganism, and we found her in chapter 2, verse 20. I made a mistake. There are 4 in all. I gave you 1. That was Israel. Now here are the other 3. So the second one is Jezebel. The third one is the scarlet woman. The scarlet woman, and she is the apostate church. She represents the apostate church. And when we speak of apostasy, it is wrong teaching, false teaching. Okay, apostate church. So the scarlet woman represents the apostate church, and she's in chapter 17, verse 3. And the fourth woman of Revelation is the wife of the Lamb. The wife of the Lamb, or you could say the bride of Christ. but she's represented as the wife of the Lamb, and she represents the true church, God's true church. She's in chapter 19, verse 7. Chapter 19, verse 7. So there are four women used in Revelation to symbolize four different concepts. The first one is the woman here in chapter 12 representing Israel. The second one is Jezebel representing paganism in chapter 2, verse 20. The third one is the scarlet woman representing the apostate church or the church of heresy in chapter 17, verse 3. And the fourth one is the wife of the Lamb or the bride of Christ, which is the true church in chapter 19, verse 7. Good? Not going too fast? All right. Now let's get down to the next identity we need to take note of. She was with child. She cried out. We're going to get into this in detail in just a minute. Then in verse 3, these are your lecture notes. Then another sign appeared in heaven. This is the second sign. There are 7 of them. The second sign, and behold, a great red dragon. He had 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. The great red dragon represents the woman's enemy, and that is Satan. The great red dragon represents Satan. You're going to see him as Satan in Revelation 13 times as the great red dragon. So when you see the dragon from here out, it's Satan. The color red, the great red dragon speaks of bloodshed. Okay, we go on down a little bit further. I'm giving you these identities. And then in verse 5, and she gave birth to a son, a male child. The next symbolic representation will be the male child. And of course, that's Jesus Christ. The male child is Jesus Christ. Important in your notes now to make a note that you understand that he was of Jewish descent. Jesus was a Jew. If you talk to many of the Orthodox Jews or Messianic Jews in Israel, they will tell you they have no problem with Jesus. Their problem is with Paul. They look at Paul as a traitor. But Jesus was a Jew of Jewish descent, and he is the male child.
Is that even the Messianic Jews?
Yes.
They don't like Paul?
No. They feel like he was a traitor because of what he did in his early life and the persecution, they feel like he was a traitor against the Jews. Oh, we're going to get into that in your lesson. Just hold on. Yes, sir. No, they're symbolic, but we'll get into that in just a second. Yes, sir. Put a note here. Remember, in the second half of the Great Tribulation, Satan is taking advantage of 2 things. So in the second half of the tribulation, it's called the Great Tribulation, Satan is taking advantage of 2 things. Those 2 things are this: the raptured church is now in heaven. So all of the believers, or the ones that were there upon rapture, are gone. He has nothing, no resistance from the believers. And the second thing would be the presence of increased demons from chapter 9. Remember the hordes of demons in chapter 9. So Satan is getting ready to wreak havoc in the second half of the tribulation. Just to finish up on that concept with Bailey, our guide over there, anyone in here that went with us? I don't think so. He was an Arab Jew, Messianic Jew, and I remember being in the tunnels under the old portion of the city. You can go through the tunnels where David had tunnels made to build the walls. It's still there. You have to walk. It's probably 3 or 4 inches of water in there. You have to bend over and walk through there. And we got to a place where we were resting, and I remember asking him, as a Messianic Jew, how do you feel about the fact that the Jews put Christ on the cross? He just hung his head. He wouldn't even answer me. It's a very, very sensitive subject. Very sensitive. Less than 1% of the Jews in Jerusalem right now are Messianic. All right, so that's the three identifications we'll make right now, or the 7 signs, 3 of the 7 that we'll make right now. Make note, there's going to be a final war or a final rebellion at the close of the millennium, and we'll get there soon. Here in chapter 12, John is introducing us to 3 of the characters involved in that war. That would be the woman, the dragon, and the male child. Now, how does this affect us, Mike? How is it applicable to us now? Since that day in the Garden of Eden that sin was introduced to mankind, there has been a war against good against bad. Okay? And that war is going to come to a head, if you will, at the end of the tribulation. And these are some of the characters that are going to be involved in that war. Okay? I wanted to tell you in verse 1, and then again, each time he mentions the woman and then the male child and then the dragon, he uses the word great. The Greek word for great appears here in this chapter 4 times, verse 3, 9, 12, and 14. And that word means this. In the Greek context, it means huge in size or huge in significance. So here they are huge in significance. These are significantly important, these 3 characters he's describing. Also, Barry mentioned, and we're going to get into it in a deep way in just a second, as he's mentioning the woman here in verse 2, he said she was with child, she cried out. Going up to verse 1, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. I wanted to give you this reference. You'll find in Genesis 37, Genesis chapter 37, verses 9, 10, and 11, that directly reflects Joseph's dream. He dreamt of the sun, the moon, and the crown of stars. So there's a reference to Joseph's dream in Genesis 37 as to what John is writing here. Now, I wanted to give you this last note. We said we're going to study chapter 12 in 3 different sections. So the first section, we're going to identify the woman, the child, and the dragon deeply here in just a minute, in verses 1 through 6. In verses 7 through 12, we're going to teach the war in heaven. And then in the third section, in verses 13 through 17, we're going to teach the woman being persecuted. Of course, that's Israel. So the first section is identification of the woman, child, dragon. Second section is the war in heaven. Third section is Israel being persecuted. Interesting, we're getting ready to do some research, but I've been asked the question many times in my ministry, why did God choose the Israelites or the Jewish nation as his chosen people? And the generic answer to that is, God is sovereign, he can do what he wants, and he chose them. But there's actually a literal answer to that we're going to get into here in chapter 12, not today, but I want to let you know we're going to bring you things of that interest as we get into chapter 12. So if you have your lesson, you'll see on the front, again, don't make fun of my pictures here. I'm doing the best I can. This is the woman, the child, and the dragon. And we're going to get into session 18. And we call this first section this time the high points. Beginning in chapter 12, Revelation is now going to take a detour from step-by-step narrative of the end times. So we're going to take an exit ramp, if you will, and we're going to get out of the step-by-step narrative. What is a narrative? Someone tell me. What is it, Bailey? It's a story without need of explanation. When we talk about gospel narrative or biblical narrative, it is what it is and we don't question it. Okay? Genesis chapter 6 is a really good example of that with Nephilim. The word says it and we don't question it. So here Well, we're going to get into a different sort of thing now, where the events described here are going to cover a wide variety of eras, including past, present, and future. In the course of these visions, 7 main characters are going to be described. 5 of these appear in this chapter, and the next 2 chapters will continue to fill in the details. So 5 of the 7 main characters of the end of time are going to be in chapter 12. Chapter 15 adds another vision of heaven, and chapter 16 will return to a more chronological depiction of the last days. All right, so we're going to take a detour from into these chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15, and we're going to identify the characters of what's getting ready to happen at the end of time. Sort of like we're going to go now and look at the trailer tributes in a movie and read the characters, okay, and see what's going to be happening. This passage typifies the grand symbolism found in much of the book of Revelation. So here, remember, there are 3 ways John writes Revelation. First, literally, and we have been in literal narrative now for 4 chapters. Then he writes it historically, and then he writes it symbolically. So now we're into a rich field of symbolism in these next few chapters. John sees a woman clothed with the sun. How is that possible? How is she clothed with the sun? What do you think he means by that? Anybody got any input on that? Have you ever seen a picture or looked at someone and the sun's behind them and it looks like the sun has just enveloped them? And that I've got a picture on my phone of my kids. The other day, I took a picture and the sun was behind. What he means is she's enveloped by the sun. Now, what do you think that's going to mean? What does the sun represent in New Testament church? Christ and the new covenant, being saved by Christ, right? And so the woman, being Israel, is enclosed or enveloped by the saving grace of Jesus Christ. You see how that works? So when she's enclosed by the sun, you'll see that in a minute, he's pointing out she's enveloped by the saving grace of Jesus Christ. John sees a woman clothed with the sun crying out in pain as she gives birth. I'm in the second paragraph. Where else did we see birth pains? Remember back in Matthew 24 when Jesus was talking about the end times that we're studying? He said it'll be like a woman's birth pains. Crying out in pain as she gives birth, waiting to kill her child, is a red dragon. The woman symbolizes Israel, the dragon is Satan, and the male child, of course, is Jesus. The male child is caught up to God, a reference to Jesus' ascension after his resurrection, and the woman is able to flee into the wilderness, as you're going to see. Next, John observes a war in heaven, where Michael, the archangel, fully casts Satan out of heaven. Now, it may surprise you that Satan does have access to heaven with God's permission. You'll find that all the way back into the first book of the Bible. What's the first oldest book of the Bible? Job. You'll find that in Job chapter 1, verse 1, 2, and 3, where Satan approached God in heaven with his permission. So here we're going to see later on that Satan is cast out of heaven. This is not a depiction of the initial fall of Satan that you'll find in Ezekiel, but according to the Old Testament books such as Job, the devil was still able to access heaven and cause and accuse humanity before God. At this point, however, he will be entirely evicted and thrown down to earth. Now, you remember back in our study of the seals when this happened. Do you remember that, when Satan was thrown to earth? And that's when havoc really broke out on earth, okay? This results in a rejoicing in heaven, but it's also a very dire warning. Now that Satan is running out of time and confined to the earth, his rage will be taken out on mankind, especially on Israel. So let's get to a verse-by-verse description. And again, why are we studying Revelation? What is the reason for that? Someone tell me. It is to what? Warn you, prepare. It's not to scare, it's to prepare. You have to be prepared But you say, I'm not going to be here. Why do I need to be prepared? You need to be prepared to let others know so they will go with us. If we don't know what's happening or what's going to happen, we cannot witness and disciple to others. We can tell them here in regard to what Bailey just pointed out right now, while we're here, why are we teaching it? To prepare us. It is a revealing of the end times. Why, though? Why do we need to know that? Well, I'll give it to you this way. Here's two words I want you to make sure you write down the definition to. What is godly wisdom? Godly wisdom. And here's the definition. Godly knowledge plus godly experience equals godly wisdom. The knowledge is what we're obtaining here in this study, Pam. The experience comes with life. And that gives us godly wisdom. Why do we need that? In order to be able to prepare others, or as Dave points out, to help them to understand, to fear God. So here's the next definition. Fear, godly fear equals godly respect. It's not that we're scared of him, although we should be. We respect him. We really don't want to be a part of this. There are 3 deaths that you could experience. All of us are going to experience the death of physical death, unless we get raptured first. The second death is the spiritual death to the old man we preached on last week, being born again, right? The third death that you don't want to experience is the separation from God, or being eternally in hell. You don't want to experience that. How do we avoid that? By studying what's going to happen. We can study Noah's Ark, for 10 years, but that's not going to help us to understand what's getting ready to happen. Again, when we look at it just prophetically, what's happening around the world as recently as last night, there is still fulfilling prophecy. Still fulfilling prophecy. If you think what's happening over there just happened a month or so ago, you're not paying attention. Some of that stuff has been in effect for the last 15 years. That's been planning what's going on over there. It's fulfilling prophecy. So if that's what's happening here, and we want to be prepared, we want to understand the revealing of God's word, we need to study this, because godly knowledge plus experience gives us godly wisdom. Now, we'll say this. We had a question in Tender Warriors the other night about wisdom. Wisdom is relevant, isn't it? So let's take, I don't know, we're all the same age. So let's take, Bailey and Seth. Seth is a young man like 20 years old. Both of them are wise, but Seth cannot have the same amount of godly wisdom because he's 30 years younger than Bailey. You see what I mean? All right, let's get into verse 1. We're at the top of page 2, and we're right on time. Here in verse 1, John says a great sign, so we know that word in the Greek that he wrote, in the Koine Greek, great means it's of huge significance. That's what he's saying. This is extremely important. A great sign, not just a sign, but a great sign, appeared. And it's a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. So let's get into this. John tells us in this verse that a sign, this is the first sign of 7 that are going to appear here in chapters 12 and 13. And it's a woman clothed with the sun. She is the first of 7 key figures described in this part of Revelation. The moon was under her feet, and she wore a crown of stars on her head. This sign was and is the first of several to come. And I gave you all of the places where the other 6 are right there. Although the sign of the woman appears in heaven, the events that ensue take place on earth. This is very interesting. Make a note, clothed with the sun means that she's enveloped by the sun. The sun represents Jesus Christ's saving grace, and so it represents Jesus saving Israel, or his chosen people, and we are a part of that. You'll find that in John chapter 10. The woman symbolizes Israel. Genesis 37 tells us Joseph, Jacob's favorite son, had a dream in which Jacob's other sons and parents bowed down to him. And you'll remember he dreamt that the reeds in the field, the other reeds bowed down to him. And when he told his father Jacob about the dream, his father immediately applied the imagery. The sun and moon were Joseph's father and mother. Jacob also named Israel and Rachel. Joseph's brothers were the 11 stars. The crown on the woman's head probably signifies that Christ's future kingdom will center in Israel. Now, I've put the word probably, but assuredly is going to center in Israel. Although Joseph's brothers bowed down to him in Egypt, someday restored Israel will bow down to Jesus, who is far greater than Joseph. Let's go to verse 2. And she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. John records that the woman appeared in the sign in heaven, was crying out in pain. She was experiencing the trauma of giving birth. We learn from verse 5 that the child is appointed to rule the nations with an iron rod. This statement is a clear reference to Jesus Christ. Isaiah prophesied the birth of Christ in Isaiah 7:14. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God is with us. Isaiah 66 predicts that the woman would deliver a son before her pain came upon her. This prediction seems to refer to the fact that Israel would bring forth Christ before the painful tribulation period, which he did. Israel's refusal to accept Christ, the Messiah, will bring the nation unprecedented pain in tribulation. You'll find in 1 Thessalonians 5:3, it alludes to the painful tribulation by noting, while people are saying there's peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them, as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and they will not escape. I want to take you to this portion of commentary. I didn't put it in the lesson. Being clothed with the sun speaks of glory, dignity, and the exalted status of Israel. So clothed in the sun speaks of glory, dignity, and being exalted by God. The people of promise who will be saved and given a kingdom. The picture of the moon under her feet possibly describes God's covenant relationship with Israel, since the new moons were associated with worship. The 12 stars represent the 12 tribes of Israel. All right? So those stars, Barry, represent the 12 tribes of Israel. Let's go to verse 3, as we're getting ready to get into some deep stuff here. Then another sign. So the first sign was the woman symbolizing Israel. The next sign, in verse 3, another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon. So this is a very hugely symbolic entity here, the great red dragon, having 7 heads, 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. In verse 3, John uses figurative language here in describing Satan's domination of 7 past worldly kingdoms and 10 future kingdoms. So that's going to come into play in the next few chapters of how Satan, what is Satan called in the New Testament? The prince of, say again?
Prince of this world, the prince of air.
Prince of the power of the air. He's a prince of the spiritual world. We live in a physical world. And so without Christ, we have no defense against him. We are eternal beings, right? Made to live forever. When you die, you're not going to stop living. You're going to walk through a door and you're going to be in a much more beautiful community than you're in now. This is just a shadow of what's to come. But without Jesus Christ, we won't go to heaven. And without him, we are susceptible to Satan. Why? Because he rules this spiritual world now as between us and the goodness of God. So that's why we must be sealed, saved and sealed by Holy Spirit against Satan. Here in verse 3, John uses figurative language in describing his domination of the past worldly kingdoms and the 10 futuristic kingdoms. And you'll find that in Daniel chapter 7. John saw another sign appear in heaven, which is a great red dragon. This is the second of 7 important figures mentioned in Revelation. Verse 9, and we'll read that in just a second, identifies the dragon as Satan. So let's go to verse 9 of chapter 12. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him, and they are demons. Now, it's important you make a note of this, that there are different rankings of demons, just as there's different rankings of angels. The worst of the worst are in the abyss. And we know that because we have examples of when Jesus cast out demons, they would ask Jesus, please don't put us in there where the other ones are. Okay? So there's different rankings of demons as well. I'm still on the bottom of page 2. The dragon had 7 heads and 10 horns, and each of his heads had a diadem, a crown-like object similar to a headband. The imagery suggests that Satan holds absolute sway over political entities in the tribulation. During the 7 years of tribulation, Satan, who's going to be using the Antichrist and the false prophet, will rule the political world. He will totally dominate the political and the economical global world. The 10 horns represent 10 kings who reign for a while, with the first beast mentioned in Revelation 13, which we haven't gotten to yet. And you'll find that in Daniel 7 as well, prophesies this confederacy of 10 kings. Today, as the God of this world, and that's what we just touched on the prince of the air, Satan dominates the evil world system. And that was Paul writing in 2 Corinthians 4. But this influence will be even more potent and more obvious during the tribulation. Why, if you want to make a note there, why will it be more potent during the tribulation? Remember I gave you the 2 reasons? Do you remember what they were? The one was the church will be raptured. He has no resistance from the church on earth. And the other reason is he will be surrounded by hordes of demons. In John 12:31, Jesus calls Satan the ruler of this world. When he tempted Jesus, he offered Jesus all the kingdoms of the world if Jesus would just fall down and worship him. You find that in Matthew chapter 4. In the tribulation, Satan's political power will reach its peak. He will use the 2 beasts of Revelation 13 to suppress millions of people, probably billions. Let's go to page 3. Another picture of the woman, the child, and the dragon on page 3. In verse 4, and this is important. Anytime you hear someone preach or teach on where the demons came from, they're going to reference Revelation chapter 12, verse 4, as well as chapter 13, but mostly here in chapter 12. Let's read this together. In verse 4, and his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven. The stars indicate what? Are they celestial stars? They are angels. Those stars are angels. All the way back to the beginning of Revelation, we said the stars are going to indicate angels. So 1/3 of the stars of heaven fell, and he threw them to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. So if you think about a woman a woman who's pregnant, if you wanted, and it sounds morbid, but it is what it is, if you wanted to destroy that child, what is the most advantageous time to do that? Right after it's born. The woman is pretty much, you ladies who have had children, you're weak. Your body's trying to recover itself. That's why you have a doctor or a midwife or somebody to take care of the baby. And so he's waiting for the baby to be born to devour the baby while the woman is helpless. Okay, that's the symbol here. And I know it sounds morbid, but that's what's going on here. So apparently in verse 4, Satan has access to heaven. Of course, he does not reside there, but he often appears before God to accuse believers. You'll find that in verse 10. So let's go to verse 10 while we're in chapter 12. Then I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down, he who accuses them before our God day and night. Back to our lesson. In the middle of the tribulation, Satan will lose his access to heaven. So this particular point in our timeline now is right in the middle of tribulation. Satan will lose his access to heaven. Now, say again? Scholars differ on whether this specific reference to a third of the stars of heaven is a reference to Satan's work in corrupting 1/3 of the angels of heaven, or a point about his immense earthly power at this time. Either way, Satan and all rebelling demons will be cast down and barred from their normal communication with God. I put that in there trying to be transparent and objective, but I want to go with it's Satan's work in corrupting 1/3 of the angels. He corrupted 1/3 of the angels when he fell. That's what happened there, okay? Which means that the angels could make a decision. They were influenced, if you will, to fall by Satan. Revelation 12:4 depicts Satan standing before the woman so he might destroy the woman's child. So once again, this is Satan standing before Israel to destroy Jesus Christ. Satan's opposition to God's plan to redeem fallen mankind is apparent from the dawn of human history and is abundantly clear in Herod's attempt to kill baby Jesus. You all know the story, right? Whom he saw as a threat to his kingship. You'll find that in Matthew chapter 2. Satan has always tried to destroy Israel, as is apparent in the long-standing evil of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism means against the Jews, okay? His hatred of Israel will reach an all-time high during the second half of the tribulation, which is referred to as 1260 days. Satan's original rebellion, you'll find in Ezekiel 28, resulted in 1/3 of the angelic host joining his insurrection and becoming demons themselves. So the Old Testament is backing up exactly what John is writing of here in Revelation 12. In verse 5, and she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Now this is interesting. We want to dive way into verse 5 here. Jesus Christ, I'm going to read you another portion of commentary. Jesus Christ is the male child. He was of Jewish descent. Despite Satan's efforts to destroy Israel and the Messianic line, Jesus' birth took place as predicted by the prophets. The rod of iron describes Jesus' coronation as king over the nations of the world. Where will we see that come into play? Where will we rule or reign with Christ? When's that going to happen? During the millennium, right? We will reign with him. An iron rod over the entire world during the 1,000 years of his reign. So let's look at verse 5. This verse reports that the woman John saw brought forth a male child who was destined to rule the nations with a rod of iron. This child is the third of the 7 critically important figures described in this passage. That would be the woman, the red dragon, and the male child. Isaiah 9 prophesies that this child will bear the government on his shoulders, and there will be no end to his government and peace. By the way, the number for that, the governmental number in God's word is 12 right there, if you want to make a note. He will rule with justice and righteousness from the throne of David. Zechariah prophesied that Jesus shall sit and rule on his throne. And Psalm 2:7 through 9 prophesies that God the Father will give his Son Jesus the nations of his inheritance and the ends of earth for his possession, and his Son will break them with a rod of iron. This rule will follow the tribulation, and it will last 1,000 years. That is the millennium. And that's explained to us in Revelation chapter 20. And we will be with him. What's the reason for the millennium? Who can interject? Why don't we just go ahead and go into eternity? Anybody? Bailey?
You're wrong. I thought there's still others that will still come.
There are many others that will still come to be a part of God's elect, is one good reason. Another reason is God's going to do it the right way like he meant the first time, before sin entered into the world. We will reign with him as rulers. We will be the ones helping him rule the nation. The headquarters, if you will be in Jerusalem. And it will be a joyous time. It won't be sinless. If you do the math, we could go through 12 generations or so. And there still will be people who will be lost. But there will be many more who will be saved. Remember, the end of time will not happen until the last soul of God's elect is saved. Okay? So that was the key answer I was looking for, until the last one is brought in. All right? Let's go to the bottom of page 3. Satan's effort to destroy Jesus, the Messiah, failed, obviously. Jesus arose from the dead and ascended to heaven. And John testifies here that the woman's child was caught up to God and to his throne, reflecting that an event which has already occurred. He's talking about Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Let's go to page 4. There's a picture there of the woman, and I tried to depict what was going on. I don't like where it says a woman is Church of God. I would mark that out and put Israel there. But the rest of it is pretty scripturally sound. But the woman is Israel, which of course is God's church, but it's Israel. Verse 6, then the woman fled into the wilderness. This brings an immense amount of opinion, if you will, from apologetics and so-called Bible scholars of what's happening here, because I want to compare this with something and then we'll talk about it. Verse 6, then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days. Again, when he speaks of 1,260 days, it's at the end of the tribulation. Now I want to go down to verse 14. So put your finger on verse 6 and then go to verse 14. We'll back up to verse 13. And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to earth, he persecuted the woman. So after Satan is thrown to earth, he persecutes the woman, which is Israel, and who gave birth to the male child, which is Jesus Christ. But the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place, where she was nourished for a time and times half a time from the presence of the serpent. And there's a reference there to the serpent as far as Satan. So let me take you to the commentary here. The wings of a great eagle are not actually birds' wings, but a graphic depiction of God's providential protection of Israel. Wings often speak of protection. We see that all through the Psalms. Eagles probably were like vulture-like griffins, were the largest birds known in Palestine. So he's trying to depict here the protection of an eagle. And researching this past week, there are certain species of eagles down in the rainforest under the tropical canopy that actually fly in, pick up full-grown monkeys and eat them. In verse 6 and verse 14, this does not represent the United States. You'll hear people talk, they want so badly for the United States to be included in end times prophecy. This does not in any way mean that she's running to United States. And I've heard, because United States is an ally of Israel, and we are, and so on and so forth, that these wings of an eagle must mean she's running to the United. No, it does not. It does not mean that. The United States doesn't exist during the end times, okay? And the end times, remember, we're in the last days. The end times are after rapture, dealing with Israel. So I just want to make that point. If you hear that, and I'm just going to say it because, I have nothing. He can sue me if he wants. But John Hagee is wrong on this. Hagee teaches that means that United States is going to take care of Israel through the tribulation. No, sir, we won't, because we won't be here. Okay? I just want you to understand that. So let's get into verse 6, and we'll be at the end of our lesson today. She fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared by God, so that there she should be nourished for 1,260 days. Last page. An indeterminate length of time separates verses 5 and 6. So look at this. We don't know how long of time this is, meaning we don't know when rapture is going to occur. She gave birth to the Son, and that's Jesus Christ. He's going to rule the nations with the rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God in his throne. What does that mean, caught up to God? He's speaking of his ascension. All right? He ruled, and he's caught up to God. What did he tell Nicodemus? My kingdom is not on this earth. My kingdom is in heaven, in the spiritual world. What he told Pontius Pilate, standing on the porch. He ruled, and then he was caught up. We don't know, John doesn't tell us the amount of time, because if he did, then we'd know when this was going to happen. We don't know. So between verse 5 and 6, why am I telling you that? Anyone who says, I know that the rapture is going to occur on September 8th of 2030, take them here. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. There's an indeterminate amount of time between these two verses. In the middle of the tribulation, remember that's the door swings open at exactly the middle of the tribulation. That's when the Antichrist breaks his covenant with Israel and he begins to attack Israel. The false prophet in Jerusalem will erect an image to the beast who achieves enormous political power. This false prophet demands that everyone worship that image. We're going to see that in the next chapter. Failure to worship the image means you die. Many Jews will understand this adulterous act to be the abomination of desolation that Jesus referred to in Matthew 24. They will act upon his warning. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains in Matthew 24. These Jews will escape to the mountains. By doing so, they will escape the invasion of the north. Do you see what's happening here? The woman represents Israel. So Jesus is saying in Matthew 24, the Jews are going to escape. So what John's writing here is answering Jesus' prophetic words, saying, in those days when this happens, the Jews are going to escape to the mountains. That's the woman escaping to the mountains. You see how this fits together? Everybody get that? Okay. By doing so, they're going to escape the invasion of the north that we studied in Ezekiel 38 before we got into this, which is what? Most likely Russia. If you go north of Israel, you're in Russia, into Palestine. You'll find that in Ezekiel 38 and Joel 1. The place God has repaired, and I find it kind of ironic. These guys that teach that she's running to the United States, she's actually going to go to Russia, which is ironic to me. Kind of funny. The place God has prepared for the fleeing Jews may be Petra, also called Selah, the capital of Edom. You'll find that in Isaiah 16. Why does that matter? I can take you to Isaiah chapter 9 and show you that the mayor of New York City quoted Isaiah after 9/11, didn't know he was quoting it. This is prophecy being answered. Whatever the place of safety is, it will provide sustenance for the escapees for how long? 1,260 days, as Bailey points out, until the last one is saved. Until the last one. This is 3.5 years, or the second half of the tribulation. Anytime you see 1,260, that's the second half. These locations are likely candidates due to their combination of terrain, with mountains and caves. Various biblical references to this event mention both wilderness and or desert and mountains, both of which can be found in these regions. So during those days, as Jesus prophesied in Matthew 24, the Israelites are going to run into those mountains. They're not going to be brought to the United States on the wings of an eagle. I want to make sure you knew that. That gets us to verse 7. We're going to start next week in verse 7 with Satan thrown out of heaven, or a war in heaven. This tumultual event on earth during the tribulation will find their counterpart in heaven. A state of war has existed since the fall of Satan. Something will intensify that warfare, possibly. What would that be? What's going to intensify the warfare in heaven? What do you think it will be? It's going to be rapture. Rapture is going to pull the trigger on all of this. Okay? The day that you and I, if we're alive, are raptured, the trigger gets pulled. Okay?